Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to Building the Black Educator Pipeline podcast. I am your host, Shana Terrell, educator, activist, dedicated to the lifelong struggle of freedom and liberation for her people. Shout out to everybody out there watching today. As always, my co-conspirators, we welcome you back every week. And to our new folks joining our circle and supporting us today, thank you. Thank you for the love. We appreciate you. We are still running our We Need Black Teachers national campaign targeted at our high school population. To learn more about our campaign, please check us out at www.weneedblackteachers.org to find out more about the campaign and how you can support. And shout out to Citizens Ed and the Center for Black Educated Development for creating this platform where we can talk to real people in the real struggle, doing the real work. I'm super excited about our guest today. We'll be hearing from a very powerful Black woman voice in education leadership. So today's topic will really center on equity, education equity, it being a fundamental right. So today we will be talking to Dr. Khalilah Harris. She leads the education policy team at the Center for American Progress and is a non-resident senior fellow with the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. She's worked on expanding access to educational opportunity, community organizing, youth advocacy, and building an inclusive workforce while viewing those challenges through a racial equity lens. Dr. Harris served as first deputy director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans during the Obama administration and led the development and implementation of the first White House Summit on Diversity and Inclusion in Government. In addition to being a proud alumni of Morgan State University, she has obtained a law degree from the University of Maryland of Law and a doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Penn. And her most important role is a mom of 3 beautiful daughters. So please welcome Dr. Khalilah Harris to be with us today. What's up, Doc?
To be here in the house in the number with you. Shout outs to Morgan State University for homecoming weekend. I'm so glad I went to Morgan State.
Yes. And I want to shout you out too. This isn't in your bio, but just the long history and connection that you have with children and community. Shout out to you for many years ago coming to Shoemaker Shoe Crew, our old school, and being being our keynote speaker for one of our graduations. So shout out to you, always out here supporting us and doing the work. We appreciate you. Definitely. So, welcome today. We are hyped that you are here today.
I'm glad to be here.
Listen, as I stated, one of the powerful voices right now in educational leadership and ed policy. So, we are grateful that you took your time out today to be with us. One of the most important questions that I ask, and one of the first questions I ask my guests when they come on is, we would love to know about your educational journey. Like, what inspired you to be an educator? What inspired you to be in education?
Yeah, so, I think I've always been justice minded from the time I was 13 and 14 with the NAACP's Brooklyn Youth Council. I was knocking on doors in housing projects trying to register people to vote. They probably were like, why is this baby at my door in this yellow shirt? But, it was whatever's like, power to the people. That's why I'm at the door. Can I get your registration? But, when I went to Morgan State University, immediately I dived into public service and began mentoring and tutoring at a school in Baltimore City that was in the middle of a housing project called Lexington Terrace. It was called Lexington Terrace Elementary. And I'm working with these kids, and it was so clear to me that they couldn't read, but they were so smart. They were so smart. They had jokes. They would joke each other. It was very familiar to me coming from Brooklyn to Baltimore, but they couldn't really read. And that sat in my spirit, that planted a seed that said, again, Khalilah, there's something you need to do about this. And so, that really sparked a fire in me to want to get into education. When I got to law school, I told people I was applying to law school so I could become a sports and entertainment attorney. Yes. And then they said, okay, so, what are your immediate plans after law school? I'm like, oh, I'm going to be a sports and entertainment attorney. But in 15 years, when I make a lot of money, I'm going to open a school and I'm going to cure public education and make sure that it works for all. People were like, what are you talking about, girl? So While I was in law school, I started working in public education, but from a youth advocacy standpoint, working with an organization called Community Law in Action, where we were teaching the young people how the law was for them and not against them, or that they were not outside of the law. So teaching them about the Constitution, about their rights, about stop and frisk, about all the ways that they should understand that the law should not be taking advantage of them and their families. And from there, I went on to manage the high school programs for that organization immediately after law school, and led a design team to open one of two new high schools in Baltimore City. So that was my entry point into public education. It was working with youth advocates around their voice in the legal system. That poured into a law-related education program in the big box high schools at the time in Baltimore City over 20 years ago, to leading the team of community educators and other partners to start a school that was focused on social justice and public policy.
Listen, this is amazing, amazing work. And you are like a living testimony of when we talk about building a Black educator pipeline. Yes, like the Center for Black Educator Development, we exist to recruit more young Black people into the pipeline to be teachers. But this pipeline is so complex and so multifaceted. And your job and the work that you're doing and the work that you've been doing in terms of law and focusing on policy is super important for us to be removing these barriers that our children and our community are faced with. I think the other dope and amazing part about you and your spirit and your work, some people want to become lawyers to like, I want to make that money. So even though you're like, yo, I'm gonna do sports and entertainment, at the heart of it and at the end of all of it, you're still like, but I'm going to open a school for children. Like we still have problems that I would like to solve that are internal and in the community.
Yeah.
So to have that focus and that drive, I think is much appreciated. Again, dedicated to that lifelong struggle.
Yeah, I live based on the Sankofa principle of reach back to move forward. And it had never struck me that you don't use money to help community. It really had never struck me. So even growing up in New York City, being a Brooklyn girl, tried and true, you want the new sneakers, you want the fresh outfit, but it never struck me that you don't use some of your money to pour back into the community, or you don't use some of your resources, it may not be dollars, to pour back in the community. That is just a foreign concept to me, and it always has been. So I always was taken aback when people thought it was strange that I would say that. Suffice to say, I never went to the NBA or the NFL or Bad Boy Entertainment or whatever,
yes.
but I'm good with what I've done. But nonetheless, it was always the vision to pour back into community.
And Doc, let me just say, I knew I liked you, girl, because you're from New York. Okay, shout out, I'm from the South Bronx. So
I can hear it in your voice.
Oh, you hear the accent. It's still living. It's still living in me.
Oh,
yes.
okay. Yep.
So I knew I liked her. Shout out. Okay. So your work right now, you are at the Center for American Progress.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about that? How does this organization really help change the landscape of education?
Yeah, so CAP is how it's known mostly in these DC streets, although I'm in Denver presently at a conference. But in the DC streets and on the national landscape, people know the organization as CAP. And there are about 19 policy teams that focus on a range of issues that are targeted at making sure that people have access to an inclusive economy, a strong democracy, that they have a climate that supports their long health, their children's long health, and generations beyond, but also in the realm of education, that students have access to resources that close gaps in opportunity, and that we are establishing policies with people and not doing policy to people. And that's been a refrain that existed previously, and to some extent in too many corners still in the education sector, but we do our work through an explicit racial equity lens, which is also a focus of CAP. And we do that by calling together community conversations, because it's one thing to say that you have experience either being from around the way or experiencing systems of injustice, or I went to school, so I know how to run a school. And all of those things are Not true. There does require some expertise, but what we don't have collective expertise in is the lived experience of people currently experiencing systems of inequity, systems of oppression, white supremacy, and all the ways that a system built on providing a whole lot to very few, and making sure the rich get richer, and causing people who have less to really fight with one another for scraps when that's not how our society should work. And education is a through line between all of the ways that we can come together to make sure that we can practice self-determination. So the work that we are presently doing under my
Khalilah.
hello. So, the work that we're doing under my leadership, at least, has focused on taking an explicit racial equity lens, using people first language, none of that at-risk youth, low-income kids. It's like kids don't have jobs, so stop calling them low income. Kids are only at risk when adults don't do what they're supposed to do. How about you name them as children first, so you care for them as if they're in your family, but also hear the voices of young people, educators, and families and communities directly impacted by these policies, so we can make them stronger. And also because those people will fight tooth and nail if you try to take policy away from them that they created. So that's the work that we're doing at CAP.
Yes, leading the good fight. And this is dope, because I think a lot of times it's important to focus on folks who are in the forefront in education, right? Our frontline soldiers, our teachers, our administrators. But there are people like you who are quietly in the background. And what's funny about that, some other folks hope that it stays quiet, right? Because policy is big, right? Policy is major in the world of money, in the world of education, right? Policy is politics.
Absolutely.
So the fact that we have a voice in there and someone like you leading such great policy and great work is super important. But I think we should find ways to get this out there for folks to know more about it. One of the major things you just said is doing things with people, and not for them or not to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this question to ask later on, but I would love for you to elaborate on that now in terms of like, what does that look like? Because you believe in that strongly, on doing things with the community and not for them. So can you just elaborate on what that looks like, especially in terms of government and policy?
Definitely. So, oftentimes when people who look like you and I get into policy, it's at the very tail end where they're protesting something that happened to them, or protesting not getting something that they were demanding.
Yep.
And the powers that be really make it so that people don't understand that they are the beginning of policy. And what's important is whenever we are doing community conversations, for example, the question is, what's working for you? What's not working for you? What don't we know? What are we researching that means nothing to you? We have all of this jargon out there now, social emotional learning and whole child and all these other things that if you roll up on a parent on the street, they're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you teaching my child? Are you taking care of them? You're not putting them in handcuffs. That's what parents want to know, right? And there are lots of parents who don't have that question about, are you putting my kids in handcuffs? That right now we're trying to hijack what children are learning in our schools. But I digress. It is important for us to make sure that people are aware of the policies that are swirling around that they can impact. I can't tell you how many legislators say things like, people really don't come to our offices, so when they come, I stop and listen. Or people don't write in or call in, and people swear they see these, change.org or other petitions going around that somebody else is going to sign, somebody else is going to call. And you underestimate how few people actually do that, right? But that's a part of the system. The system says they did that to us. They keep doing this. They won't let us have. And it's like, who is they? Because for real, according to the ancestors who experienced genocide and enslavement in this country, they is you. And you need to make sure you use your voice and stand up for yourselves in ways that we did not have the opportunity to. So it's important for us to make sure that people around the country and in our U.S. territories as well understand where they can push in to be involved in making laws and making change, that they can go to a legislator and say, this is what I would like to see in the law, and then advocate to have that move through the process. And oftentimes people aren't clear that they can write a law. The legislator will take all the formal steps to put it into bill format and move it through whatever body it is, your city council, your state legislature, Congress. But you have every right to say, this is a law that's important to me. Here are 50 other families that want to see every child in our schools have access to free breakfast and warm lunch, period, and that it be healthy. This is what we would like to see. And call them to task if they give you excuses or if they use language like, well, this is only what we can get done now. Okay, then when you're no longer elected, we'll see what the next person can get done. And that is intimidating to so many people because the system is set up to say, we create the laws, you just follow them, as opposed to the laws are about and start with you, and therefore we need your interaction to tell us what we should be doing. And there are a lot of things that are definitely specific and require expertise in public education. Let me not understate that. The value of our educators is critical. The value of school leaders, administrators, the value of policymakers understanding how education policies can impact whether or not a child has access to food at school, good teachers, mental health supports. But when it boils down to it fundamentally, there is no hidden sauce that parents and educators in the classrooms and students can't be involved in when it comes to creating policy and innovating on what providing a quality education to every child looks like. And right now, we're not in innovation stage. We're in let's do what we've been doing and hold people accountable for things that they're not actually accountable for. We use a lot of school alone strategy, even though children go to schools in a community. So we haven't been pulling in housing, transportation, access to jobs, and calling on our city officials who don't work in the school system, state officials who aren't education legislators, to be creating ecosystems that work for our children. And a phrase that I've been using lately is establishing social determinants of a quality education. We know social determinants of health, but what are the factors that make opportunity possible for all children? Right now, we know test scores are telling us how much money children's parents make, whether people admit that or not. Otherwise, if they don't want to admit that, then they are saying that children can't learn. And I reject that outright. So that's the nature of our work in doing policy with community. We don't put out any policy reports that haven't been vetted by community members or that didn't start with a community conversation or two or three to really bring the ideas together and to lift up their voices directly in those pieces. So we don't paraphrase what others are saying and use it as our own words. We think there's power in sharing what other people think, but then backing that up with data and policy.
Doc, when I say you are here speaking at fire, you are here speaking at fire. And the reason why I say you speaking at fire is because you are sitting here talking to us again in language that is comprehend, like we can understand, but you can be in a room full of parents and they'll know exactly what you're talking about. But what
Listen,
you
we were talking before this about all my student loan debt, right?
yes,
I have a bunch of degrees, but if you're giving me something to read or talking at me in language that's over my head, when it's not over my head, I don't want to hear you either. So you shouldn't have to have a doctorate or a law degree to understand when somebody's asking you to partner with them on behalf of children. And again, I think that is intentional when people do that to community members and try to make things seem more complicated than they need to be. So
it's very intentional. And that's what I was going to point out, the things that you said about how the system is set up to make you believe you don't have a voice. The system is set up to make you believe that it's not here to work for you. Like it's a secret society that you need some type of secret access to,
that's, that's right.
or some type of club, right? That we're not invited to.
And facts on facts, too many of our skin folk ain't our kinfolk and play that game
Hello,
with us too.
say
And
it
they
again.
want to be the person who is getting us access when really they're protecting their own
Oh,
territory or lifting up their own credentials and not really providing the type of access that is critical for our children. So this is why you see 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, people still talking about integration when it's like, oh word, can I just get the money that we're due so we can do what we do for our kids? But then you have black faces, brown faces in front of you like, I'm working for you, I'm working with you. And it's like, no, you're not. You're working for yourself. So we need the language, and people who know better need to equip communities with the language to call that out and to call it in, right? I'm not talking about canceling people, but I'm definitely talking about putting people in timeout so that the community can
putting folks
collectively grow
on
and move
notice.
forward.
That's
Yeah.
right. You're talking about putting folks on notice. And again, you're exactly right. It's power hoarding. You know if
Yeah,
somebody's for you when they're, available to share power, to invite you to again do things with
that's
them,
right.
to be a part of a platform. They're showing you the way, right? They're
That's
not
right.
hiding the balls and telling you I got this, so it's my job to do this. Like, let me open this door and show you what's behind it. Let me
Right.
show you all the works that's going into this, so you know how to navigate these
That's
systems.
right.
And folks don't. They most certainly do power hoard. But you was hot out the gate. Some of these questions, like I had some warm up questions, but you are hot out the gate. Okay, so
I
let's.
tried to tell you, like
You
we could
did
do
though.
this
You
stuff.
did. You definitely did. I'm like, making these warm questions though. Hot out the gate. So let's keep moving with this hotness. So again, we're talking a lot about community mobilization and what we could do for folks. But please, what can we do to build a concrete plan for reparations? Because you spoke about reparations without speaking about it, and I would
Yeah,
love to talk specifically about that in terms of education. You've hinted towards it already in some of the stuff you were saying, but let's call it out. Let's name it.
yeah.
Concrete plan for communities of color with Black folks for reparations, especially in the name of education.
For sure. So I actually wrote a piece last year about how education is a good starting point when we think about the scope of reparations that are due to Black people in America. And one of those things is eliminating the use of property taxes as the funding mechanism for public education. That is an inherently white supremacist system to the extent that we were redlined out of communities and we're not able to accumulate the type of wealth other people have. And even today, we are redlined into communities using structures like predatory lending that cause people to default or make it harder for people who qualify for loans based on their credentials, but their skin color doesn't give them access to moving into the communities that they want to move into. So definitely making sure resources are flowing in and out of schools that's based on the Constitution and equal protection under the law, as opposed to taxation schemes that keep people who are affluent able to hoard resources. And the challenge is schools are our children is the one thing that we sometimes have a difficulty in letting go of privilege.
Mhm.
And it's understandable. Our core tells us to protect our children.
Yep.
And if we can give them a leg up so they're not experiencing the racism we experience, so they can live in a safe home, a safe community, then sometimes we think that's what we have to do.
Mhm.
And it's a lot easier to move people away from collective work and community uplift when you are dangling their child's well being over them.
Right in front of them.
So, it's definitely eliminating property tax for funding public education. It is definitely the federal government increasing by triple, if not quadruple, the resources they apply to public education because they have a view across the 50 states and territories, right? To say that every individual state is going to decide how they come up to the same standard. And you can cross from state to state lines and still be within an hour of one state to the next and have a vastly different basic public education system. You can be in one state and there's drinking water that's not filled with lead, there's adequate light, there's heating and cooling, and cross over into the next state or cross over into the next district for that matter.
Yep.
And there's not proper heat in the winter, there's not proper air in the summer. All of the pipes are closed off because of lead in the pipes. That is unconscionable in the United States of America, but apparently it is allowable. And you would think it would be illegal, but it is not.
Not.
In my perspective, it is, according to the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, that all children should have access to a basic set of educational standards in terms of the environment they're learning in terms of the resources they have access to. It shouldn't be the case that we have foundations and nonprofits popping up to make sure kids have access to summer camp or extracurriculars after school
Yep.
or arts engagement, because we know that some families, that is just a basic given that that's what their children will do. And I call it the hidden curriculum. There are things that will never be put on a website on how you got your kid into that program or that program or that soccer club or that soccer club. That comes from your network. But we're
Yep.
not networked in a way to share that information. So, at a basic level, public education should be identified as a human right, as it is around the globe. And United States, I will say, is one of the Western powers that has not signed on to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So that should tell us something about the country we live in and the work we have to do. Um,
Really?
yes, really. So there are a number of things that we can do specifically when it comes to allocating resources to communities that have been historically underfunded. Um, and I can run down the list, but I know we want to get to other topics. But reparations is something serious and is something specific, and we can point to situations in recent history where students don't have access to certain amenities in their schoolhouses just based on it being a predominantly Black institution.
Right.
So when people say that was back then, I'd like to know when back then ends,
When
because I'm
yes.
still living in back then.
Back then.
So,
Right.
when we think about reparations, we shouldn't only think about the money that goes directly to families, which I do believe that should happen, but there are also other institutions that have supported the system of white supremacy that has persisted in this country for centuries.
Thanks. And listen, you don't have to slow down on this topic of reparations. And the reason why I say that is because it is a hot topic and it's an important topic. And I think that when we discuss reparations, people don't understand in its fullness how to actually gain power to really get what is rightfully ours legally.
That's right.
Um, we talk
I
a
mean,
lot about
you see some cities around the country where they have already declared racism a public health risk,
yep,
right? That's an entry point into,
it
and
is.
therefore, let me document the historic racism in this community. Let me tell you that I am the grandchild of this Tulsa, Oklahoman, and you're going to give me back my land that my grandmama had, and my grandpapa had the corner candy store, and my auntie and them had the church up the road, that you're going to give me some land or some cash back for
Or you're gonna
that.
give me my beach back. This
Listen,
beach that you
LA,
stole.
California, give me my
Yeah,
beach back.
give me my
Give me my
beach.
beach back. Thank you.
Yes.
Please and thanks. But there's so many families that can point to those direct descendancies of historic um, criminal taking from our people, but we all wake up in this country and experience the vestiges of enslavement.
Yes.
Certainly, Native Americans experience the vestiges of genocide, and
Mm.
there's no way around that. You can't point to any system where it is not the case, although people would like to put their head in the sand about it, or say things like we should have friendly talks and be kind to each other and show love, and that's how we're going to get through this. I love you with the money you will give me, and I will love you some more after. But when I talk about this, people. What I like to do, I tell people whenever I'm speaking, if I step on your toes, is so we all stand up straight.
Mm.
And the fact of the matter is, we have a scenario where we have been unwilling to say the thing and say it out loud. So explain to me why it's okay for these children to be in a school building that doesn't have drinkable water. Just explain it to me, and not allow for people to dance around that. Okay, explain to me why there are children who cannot access the internet, nor they can't access the internet in their school building because it's so old, or there's not broadband, or there's no access. There was not professional development given to their teachers, so that in the case of inclement weather, in the case of our climate collapsing around us and us needing to be at home, or in the case of us um,
And that's what
taking advantage of public health and not having provisions and systems in place to address a public health crisis. If I have to be at home, that should not be the first time my teacher is being asked to give instruction that connects me to the internet as a resource, or that I have a tool other than my cell phone. And I hate when people say that, the kids these days, they're tech savvy, they have their smartphones. Nobody's writing a research paper on their cell
on
phone.
this.
That is
And
a cop out.
yep. And some kids do, but they shouldn't be forced to. When other kids are sitting up
Any
here
kid
with
who does is not doing a good job of it, because you're not, and we
nope,
shouldn't lie about that, right?
we
Like if
shouldn't.
I saw my kid pulling up their tablet or a cell phone, like I'm working on my term paper, like I'm gonna bump you in your head. What are you talking about? Sit at that dining room table, and you're gonna do your work properly.
Yes.
But we allow, those are the little things we allow to get by when we are talking about what resources should be allocated to our children.
Yes.
And and too many people who look like the kids are guilty of that as well, and
Yes.
not willing to say, there's a line in the sand that we should not be crossing for our kids. And as long as we do so, we are culpable in them not having access to the futures that they deserve and to practice self-determination.
Yes.
We turn around and wonder why they are incarcerated, or wonder why, we have all of these jobs that are supposedly open, but not people to fill the jobs. Well, you don't really want people in those jobs, because last I checked, you need to have a certain level of computer acumen to work in Walmart, to work in manufacturing, and you
Yes.
kept that from the children too. So here we
We
are
talk,
now.
yes, we talk a lot about on this show about how all of that is intentional. Every
Mm,
single piece of it is
mm,
intentional. The one conversation that has been starting to stir now, here in Philly, I mean, the gun violence is just ridiculous. Is at an all-time high at an alarming rate, and people are trying to find like why, what's the root cause, and of course, people are right now trying to address. Right, they're being reactive in the moment. But let's go back to when you cut programs for these people. Let's go back to when you cut education funding. Let's go back to all of that. Who did you think these young people were going to grow up to be?
Where did
Who?
you think we were going to go?
Where were they going to go with with zero
Right?
resources? Right? What were they
To the
supposed to do?
basement of grandma's house, under the overpass, like
Yeah.
in the vacant houses, the next neighborhood over. Where did you think they were going
Where
to
do you think they were
go?
going to go?
And what plans were they going to come up with without the guidance of elders?
Exactly.
These are
Exactly.
the plans, right? So you have, if we want to take it to the street for a second, you have old heads saying, that's not how we used to do it back in the day. This was off limits. That was off limits. We would shoot the fair one. We're not pulling out a gun. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, where were you, OG?
Yeah.
Also, right? Like
Yes.
some people are saying things, and some people actually picked up their families and felt like they made it, right? That they could leave the hood, which all good. But the concept that you detach from your family. Now, I'm not talking about mentoring all the kids in the neighborhood, but your nephew is still out there in that community.
Yes.
Your niece is still over there, your godson, your goddaughter. So what were you doing? Were you worried about your kid's soccer game and how you made it? Or again, were you using the Sankofa principle? And so, there are so many layers to it that we have allowed for people to convince those of us who have been able to have a modicum of success, that the system is working for all people. And I push back and say the system is working as it should, but it's not work. But that is not for all people.
Correct.
And people also get their draws in a bunch when I talk about integration, and I point them back to the Brown versus Board
Go
decision,
ahead.
where
Thank you.
in the decision itself, one of the justices says, you know, uh, we should we inherently Black children cannot go to a school where there are only Black children. But come on, say that one more time. And
Go ahead.
when I point people to it in the decision, they're like, Brown is groundbreaking and blah blah blah. I'm like, okay, no doubt. I am a lawyer. I understand what Brown did, but Brown's premise was that our children could not be successful amongst each other, that they had to be in the presence of others to gain success, which I deeply reject. And that also connects to then the argument that, well, we don't need to give you more resources. Let's just bus your kids into a community that is hostile to them, and we shall overcome.
And I second your rejection.
And people
I have.
still have that philosophy. If I could just go into an affluent neighborhood, then my kids will be great. Okay, let me talk to you about the studies I've seen of Black families whose kids don't get suggested for AP, whose kids don't get promoted into gifted programs, but even though their families are in these affluent schools, in these affluent
Or
communities.
whose kids don't get culture and get to see anybody like them, who don't get to grow up in the neighbor or be in an education setting with peers just like them, who are reflective of their culture, who share their same interests, their same mindset, and their same background. That
Now
they're
that's a
terrorized and
right.
tormented by racism.
That's right. I mean,
All
it's a choice, right? It's a
yes,
choice, and you can live wherever you want. But if the premise is you have to go to the other to get quality, you are working against yourself. Oh,
yes, and we all know now, post Brown versus Board of Education, that's been detrimental to us. We know that now, which is a shame. It took what? How many years are we past that now? But it's a shame. And some people still, right? Like how you're saying, some people still celebrate it. I think the notion of fighting for equity or equality and resources, that is what is the pivotal part of that case. But the fact
100%.
that after that ruling came down, the black teacher pipeline was depleted, because that then meant that black children need to be taught by white teachers, or that then meant that in order to get your resources, you have to go over to that white school. Not, we're going to give y'all money and fair
That's right.
funding and give you more books, and y'all keep doing what y'all doing. Every last
Overwhelmingly, it did not mean you will get the equitable access to resources.
No, we
That
still
is
ain't
your
giving y'all no
right.
money. That's what that meant. We still ain't giving y'all no money. Like, you
That's what it
can, yep.
meant. That's
Okay,
the
we'll let you
whole
win this
part.
integration situation, but they knew that we will integrate and y'all will be put in hell. But again, so much that maybe you won't want this, right? But our spirit, we gonna overcome. We always
Wherever we're gonna make it
we
happen.
gonna make it happen. So we gonna overcome this nonsense and do what we have to do. Every last Thursday, I have Dr. Greg Carr on, and what he always says about the integration is, where did they think these black people came from before they entered your school? Where do you think they were taught at? You think these magnificent Negroes just dropped from the sky? No, they were being taught in black communities. Where do you think our doctors, our lawyers, where did they come from? They were being taught by us. So
That's right.
you are exactly right. The notion that we need to be othered in order to be successful
Or
is
this concept of exceptionalism, like, oh,
woo,
you the good ones. So you
yes.
come over. That's how a lot of kids got selected to integrate.
Mhm.
That family's a nice family. That family's a nice family. Let's have those families come over here with our children because they're respectable Negroes.
Mm.
And, um, a lot of folk embrace that, right? And we see the remnants of that to this day, with some deep resentment from some people, or from other people who reverted back into poverty, right? Black families are, um, uh, we have such a huge and massive racial wealth gap that you have a situation where whatever success I may have may not be indicative of what my grandchildren will have.
Right.
One slight misstep can send them back into poverty, or send them back into a circumstance where the system and government is controlling their lives because of choices they had to make.
Yes, that's most a fact. So with this, right? I think that we've been saying this too, with the pandemic happening and also the great stuff that's been going on to like kind of shut down the things that have traditionally happened in America. So I'm not saying that the pandemic is great, but I'm saying what it caused people to do, to stop,
Yeah.
to pause, to actually have to transition, to actually have to change. There are so many opportunities here that I think folks are missing. How should we be reimagining schools post COVID? What do you think we need to close these opportunity access gaps?
So I've been preaching this for the last year and a half, that so many people call the pandemic, hell, or that it ruined things. And I have been admonishing people to consider what it has opened the door for.
Yes.
There are so many resources coming from the federal government through the American Rescue Plan Act. You have monies going directly to school districts at levels that did not previously occur. You have opportunities to rethink what it looks like to be a good school, and not have that be couched just in a single test. That doesn't help teachers adjust their teaching. That doesn't help students know how they're doing. That doesn't help families know what their child's progress is until 7 months later when they get the results. That communities can push forward and really say, here are the things that equal a good school, and how are we assessing that, and where can we see it? What accountability can we hold the district or elected officials to? Thinking about the ways students are grouped. Um, I have been really pushing for school districts to come up with a permanent virtual strategy that is a hybrid, that allows for children to remain connected to schools. Some school systems opted to have a virtual option where the children were no longer enrolled in their schools, but enrolled in the district as a standalone, which I don't
Mhm.
think was very well advised. Children should still be able to go to prom. They should still be able to play on the football
Yes.
team. They should still be able to do piano with their favorite teacher, or sing in the choir at their school. But it may be best for their health. It may be best for their gender expression. It may be best for a myriad of reasons that
Yes.
they use a virtual option that is connected to a schoolhouse and adults who know them. I will never support 100% virtual. If a family chooses that, so be it. They know what's best. Maybe they're traveling around the globe. If a family is homeschooling, in that case, they do have access to adults who know them. So it's the idea of putting kids in front of computers that's problematic. We see that with students who are incarcerated and get sat behind a computer with no help from anyone and expect them to come out and not to recidivate, when we didn't do anything to really help them continue their school and academic process.
To
So,
socialize, nothing.
and to socialize with any adults or any type of school culture, to keep them on that track. So there are other ways that we can innovate. We can think about the schedules that we use. We can think about whether or not schooling should be year round instead of on the agrarian schedule, because I don't know any farmers in Philly, Baltimore, or Brooklyn. I take that back. I do know some urban farmers, but for the most part, that's not what people are doing.
Yes.
And put it on a schedule that makes sense for families, particularly families who are working. Have sensible breaks throughout the year that make sense, and that you can actually plan some academic activities that people are paid to engage with the kids around if their families need that care. But there's so many things that we can do. Unfortunately, because policies were being done to people, there is not a lot of innovation of thought for people on what should be different. So sometimes I've been talking to school leaders, administrators, and what would you do differently? They're like, oh, we would add an extra resource teacher. I'm like, what?
That's what you'll do different. That's what y'all been trying to do. Let's
Well, but they didn't have the money, right? So now that they have the money, all they can think about is fixing around the edges of what was wrong, as opposed to, well, we kind of all know this is not what we should be doing at all.
blow
So
that thing up.
right. So let's do this over here. Instead, it's like, well, we can add 2 more resource teachers, or we can bring back the clarinet program, it's like, what are you talking about? Overall, what would you do differently? And then they're like, no, money not an issue. Different. I'm like, go for it. What is it? And they have brilliant ideas, right? I talk about how in the pandemic you had universities, you had houses of worship, you had government buildings that sat empty. How are we using those spaces to move children around the community to understand what the future workforce is going to look like, to understand how people are moving through the world? So you can say, I would like to be a data scientist, and you know what the heck that means, right? I would like to be a physician's assistant. Don't you want to be a doctor? No, actually, I would like to be a physician's assistant, or I would like to be a master's in nursing. And they know why they're saying that, because they have the exposure, as opposed to, I'm going to the MBA, or I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be a lawyer. And those things really feel so far out that they don't understand what it should look like to get there. Families don't understand how to push to make sure that their kids have the exposure they need and the resources they need to get there. And again, all of those things are intentional. So if we're really thinking about redesigning public education, people have to be willing to say, you know what? As a school district, we're going to make a commitment to pilot that all of the children entering kindergarten go to a different type of school, and that we're phasing out the way school happened for elementary school, and then middle school, and then high school, because the children are going to a different school system. And that's the kind of vision and grounded leadership we need from lots of folk.
That's innovative thought, right?
Well, like to do that work to shake people up and say, don't tell me about your extra resource teacher. I got you. Let's do that this year. But in the meantime, what do we mean about schooling that works in a way that all children have access to getting what they need to make decisions about their education when they get to high school, not after high school, right? If you have middle schoolers that have no exposure to computer science, no exposure to algebra, no exposure to critical thinking and analysis at a level that allows them to get through high school in the first couple of years and then start exploring careers, then you're already behind the 8 ball. And unfortunately, that's true of too many of our children.
That's a fact. That's super true. Like, even when we talk about our exposure to the Black Teacher Pipeline, we're doing some exposure in high school because African American students they're not even pushed into the career period. But when we really start, we're like, woo, this might, eventually we're gonna have to push down into middle school, because by the time they get to high school, we want them to be able to come in and already know, hey, you know what, I want to choose an education career track. I'm really interested in education. But again, like you said, like that has to start happening sooner. It has to start happening earlier, and people just can't be afraid to like blow that thing up and choose a different route. So again, the way you're talking is like extremely innovative thinking on post COVID, what people truly had the ability to do. But again, we know this system leaves people afraid of teetering from
But listen, you
what
have
was.
people who are so wedded to things that they fought for, and forgetting that they fought for something that was a compromise because people wouldn't yield to what the children needed, right?
Needed.
So insistent, we got to do this, we got to do this. ESSA, which is, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, says this, and that. And it's like, do you remember the ESSA fight where you had a compromise just to get that? That's not actually what we wanted for the children. And so when you think about assessments and standardized tests, and it's like, when do we talk about the tests themselves being biased and the structure in which they're delivered being biased? Because then that you can hold me accountable for an assessment that is not biased and that the children have a healthy context to learn in. Then we can talk about, why didn't they perform? What weren't we doing? But until then, trying to beat me over the head and say, well, if you don't get the scores up, then you shouldn't be teaching.
You don't get the money. Yeah, you ain't teaching. Yep.
I don't think that's the way math works, but okay.
But you make a good point. People fighting for something that was a compromise. I think that that's important for folks to go into it and think about it with that lens. Another hot topic that I really want to talk about, because I think it would be amazing to get your opinion on, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the way that we are now using this term in modern day. Because you've been doing diversity and inclusion work from way old back with my man Obama. So you've been in the diversity and inclusion game for a long time, but it has now become like this buzzword, this hot topic, this hot business, like that everybody's using, like to the point where folks are hiring diversity and inclusion officers. Like that's somebody's job, right? To be about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So I would love to hear, what are your thoughts on the current evolution of some of the work you were involved on early on?
Yeah. I mean, I was doing it pre-Obama, but I digress.
Okay, all right.
That's when they just started putting a name on it. But, the place where I begin is shaking out this concept of inclusion, because inclusion typically means it belongs to somebody and they're adding you in. And I don't need you to add me into anything. When I show up, I belong there. And so you've heard a lot of shift to the concept of belonging. But as with everything, people get wedded to the term, and in some ways get lazy. It's easy to say DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion than it is to actually discuss what it is you're trying to eradicate or what you're trying to lift up. And again, that concept of inclusion really is not inclusive at all, because it continues to mean that someone is at the center and everyone else is the other, and that there needs to be work for the others to be added to the center. And I don't subscribe to that. I'm nobody's other, nor are my children. So, when we think about diversity, it's important. And on my team, whenever someone says diversity, I'm like, what kind of diversity are you talking about? And whenever I push people on that, they're like, huh? And I'm like, huh? What do you mean when you say diversity? Are we talking gender diversity, racial diversity, linguistic diversity? Because you also can't say you want to use the term minority in public education when people who look like me are the majority. So what diversity are you talking about? And if we're not explicit, which is why, at the top of the hour, I talked about how our team uses a racially explicit lens. Because if I am in Nebraska, if I am in Idaho, if I am in Bronx or Brooklyn, if I am in El Paso, Texas, or Austin, I'm not talking about the same population of people who are Black and brown. If I'm in Seattle, Washington, I better be talking about Pacific Islanders. I better be talking about the Hmong population or Malaysian population. And if I'm not, I'm not actually dedicated to creating policies that work for the people who are there, the people who need those policies. So, I wince whenever I see someone else put up DEI or diversity expert in their LinkedIn profile. I'm like, from where? When did that happen? Because, those concepts are a part, frankly, of organizational development. And if you don't have a skill set around organizational development, organizational psychology to understand how people move, shift, and change, first and foremost, your little worksheets, your workbook, and your consultancy are meaningless. There's not going to be a change on the back end. Furthermore, if you're unwilling to say to whomever is hiring you or charging you to do that work, what work are you doing to model and show that this is um, uh, the expectation for this organization?
Yes. What's your
Are
commitment to this
yeah,
work?
well,
Yes.
not only your commitment, but I noticed that Johnny got another promotion, yet Johnny has a number of HR complaints about their behavior. How
Mm,
does that happen in this organization?
yes.
Or is the bottom line really your priority? If your
Mm,
bottom line was the priority, you would have an environment where anyone can belong here, anyone can innovate, and anyone can succeed, but you're not doing that. And you're also not doing that by hiring one person responsible for this, who is not a part of your business line or your cabinet or your executive team. They're part of human resources. And
yes.
those two things don't actually go together. So and in school districts, for the most part, I will say everyone's standing up a chief diversity officer, a chief equity officer, um, to look at things and make charts of things and to all that other good stuff. But as soon as I see some school districts that are like, okay, we're pulling down this program from this school and we're going to move it to this school. And yes, we know all of you don't want to go to that neighborhood, but that's where the program is. Then I will say, okay, you're doing the work.
Yep.
But I have not seen that. I've seen a lot of let's add another one over in this neighborhood. Well, the power forces are not going to that neighborhood.
They're
So
not.
you're really talking out of both sides of your neck.
No,
Or
no.
they say things like, let's end the gifted programming. That's fine, but you still have a Park Slope versus an East New York, and you still have, Harlem and Harlem Light. You still have Washington
Mm,
Heights versus, all of those things still exist.
yep.
So you can pull down superficial structures that we know are indicators of inequity, but until you do the work of, again, creating ecosystems where there's access, equitable access for all students, then you're really putting a label or a gold star on your own shirt. I was a gold star kid. When the teacher came around and put the star on the
No.
table, it was like, where's my gold star? You better come on with it. Um, so, people put gold stars on their own lapel. And like, what did you do actually? And I'm also unwilling to accept from people the concept of incrementalism. Well, the system's too big. I guarantee you, if a war pops off next week, we're going to find the money and we're going to find the resources to make that happen.
Well,
So
we saw it.
we
We saw
listen.
it.
Don't let me go there. I don't want to be put on anybody's bad list for what I got to say about that this week. But you know,
Yes.
so
No, we need you where you at. So
I'm gonna stay right here.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, definitely. What I want to do is take a pause really quickly. We have a segment in the show where we do thank a Black teacher, and as for you, we're gonna allow you to thank some Black teachers. So definitely want to pause and give the space for this thank a Black teacher segment right now. Wow.
All right, time to thank a Black teacher. I'd like to
Yeah.
thank too. So, growing up, I never had a Black male educator, but there was one who was present in my life at all times, and his name is Roy Prescott. He was a choir director at Philippa Schuyler Middle School for the Gifted and Talented in Brooklyn, New York. He has since departed, but he impacted so many lives in Brooklyn, New York, not only because he taught so many children to sing and to express themselves, but he had a powerful bass voice. And when you heard him calling you down the hallway, you wanted to make sure you weren't doing the wrong thing. But it was so impactful to have him in our lives, and I want to shout him out and thank him very much for the way he poured into so many of us. He's also the father of my best friend and godmother to my daughters. So thank you, Roy Prescott. I also want to give a shout out to Brianna Ross. She is the newly minted Maryland Teacher of the Year.
Yay.
And I hope she becomes the National Teacher of the Year for 2022. But I remember Brianna as a special shout out again to Morgan State University. Her auntie was one of my sorority sisters and would bring her on campus all the time to take her little niece with her to class and bring her down from New York. And it's full circle to see this little girl who used to bop around our campus is now the Maryland Teacher of the Year for 2022. And I pray she will be the National Teacher of the Year for 2022 because she is an amazing educator. So thank you, Brianna.
That is dope. Oh, thank you. Brianna, we got to get you on the show. We had a couple other teachers of the year on, so we would love to get you on as
She's
well.
amazing.
Um, Daka has so many questions that we just didn't get to. But before we run out of
Have me
time,
back. Have me back.
oh, you will be back. You will probably be on here as our resident policy expert because I think again, you are talking the talk and speaking the language that people can understand, and I think that your kind of motivation and perspective will encourage more people to be involved and make this world of like policy way less intimidating than
Yeah.
what it's made to be. And again, like you said, not taking anything away from some of the things that are complicated, but you help us understand ways as a community that we should be empowered to go ahead and be involved in policy with taking ownership back in our community. So we'll definitely have you on again. But with that, I want the folks to know that you are here for freedom and liberation. So one of the questions I want to pose to you is, what does Black liberation mean to you? And how do you bring that perspective into your education policy work?
First and foremost, it is again that I am not the other and you are not the other. And you have to show up in spaces as such without asking permission to be your full selves. Black liberation for me is freeing the land. We have to make sure that we are owning land and that we're teaching our children how to use the land to sustain themselves. Because as we saw on October 4th, when the internets went down, um, technology isn't everything. But there is power in this country that comes from land ownership, and that extends to making decisions about what happens in the schools in your community, about making sure your family is fed, about making sure you have a say on what happens with the roads being built, with the transportation systems, and what type of housing exists. So I encourage people to consider plans to collaborate around land ownership in their communities and beyond. I'd also say Black liberation is a concept of understanding that nobody's ice is colder and nobody's water is wetter, that the answers you're seeking lie within you and in our community. And as long as we are looking to others to tell us what is right with us and tell us what is wrong with us, we
Mm,
will always be at odds with each other. And that is not liberatory. That is living in a different form of enslavement. So, those are the things that I teach my children. Those are the things that I apply when I'm considering policies. How does this support others in, again, practicing self determination? How does this support people in building the long game? We can look at the others on the right side of the aisle and see that they put some things in place a decade ago,
mm.
15 years ago, 20 years ago, that they are right now just using at their free will things like drawing our redistricting lines, voter registration policies. Those things did not happen overnight. So we do need to think more strategically, intentionally about the long game and what it is we want for our children and our communities.
Yes, most definitely. We are winding down on time, and I just want to thank you once again for being here. You have been a light today, a light and a breath of just knowledge, speaking truth to power, all of that. And just, I just want to say thank you, and your community is proud of you, sister. Like, you
Oh,
are doing your thing out here. The ancestors are proud. So I just want to give you a moment to say any final things you want to say to our folks out there watching today.
just it's all love. I do this for the love and I do it unapologetically. I tell people I was not born with a passive aggressive gene. So if you feel like I rubbed you the wrong way, I did it on purpose. I need you to work for our kids. I love you, Jordan, Jameson, and Kendall. Um, I, I, I I come to this work with my full and open heart, but I do try to take care of myself. So if you see me with an expensive bag, don't think that I am turning on the system, that's called, I too deserve to rise.
Yes. Yes.
But no, in all seriousness, it's just important for us to stop putting up gates in front of one another. And it goes in both directions. So if you're from the hood and you live in the hood and I'm no longer in the hood, don't tell me I can't work for the hood, because the goal
Amen.
is for us to get out the hood. That's some white supremacist theory in there. But if you out the hood, don't forget where you came from. And it is critical for us to understand that it's not going to take a few decades to upend what happened over hundreds of years. And we have to keep working until it's a reality for all our people.
Thank you so much. So shout out to everybody watching out there. And again, you now know my sister's name. So make sure you go and you follow Dr. Khalilah Harris's work and the policies that she's doing. She's always writing. She definitely has different articles and much information for us to go and educate ourselves on. I also want to take a moment just to shout out a few things that's going on at the center. This Monday, October 25th, y'all, we will be having our Monday in Bongies, which is learning, basically a classroom without walls for our high school students at 7. That will be led by staff members of the center, Sheree Hines, Stephanie Joy Tinsdale, and Dr. Carr of Howard University. So just some conversation based off of the book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate. So please join us, register. You can go to the center to find the link. And also, if you have not, and you are a man out there watching, a Black male educator, please sign up for our Black Male Educators Convening Conference. We'll be taking place November 4th and 5th. Please sign up, register to be a part of that. But I love everybody for watching us today. This has been a very energetic, energizing conversation full of so much knowledge, joy, and love from our sister. But we appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you here again next week. Same time, same place. Peace.